Outside, everything is frozen. The trees have stopped moving. The road has disappeared under a sheet of white that stretches further than any headlight can reach. The temperature gauge on the dashboard reads -42 degrees Fahrenheit, and somewhere ahead, in the pitch-black wilderness of northern Alaska, beyond the Brooks Range, past the last traffic sign most people will ever see in their lives, a man is sleeping. Not in a heated motel room, not in an airport lounge chair, not on a friend's couch. He is sleeping inside a semi-truck, parked on the shoulder of the Dalton Highway, hundreds of miles from the nearest city. And here is the part that most people never expect to hear. He is sleeping better than you are. That seems impossible. It seems like the kind of thing you say to make a point, not because it's actually true. But experienced long-haul drivers who run the northern routes, the ones who have learned to make a home out of 80 square feet of insulated steel, will tell you the same thing. The sleeper cab, when properly outfitted and properly understood, is one of the most efficient personal sleeping environments ever built. Not comfortable in the way a 5-star hotel suite is comfortable, but effective in a way that most people who have never driven through the Arctic in January simply cannot imagine. To understand why, you have to first understand the environment these drivers are operating in. And the Dalton Highway is about as honest as environments get. The Dalton Highway runs 414 miles from Livingood, just north of Fairbanks, Alaska, all the way to Deadhorse, a small industrial outpost on the shore of the Arctic Ocean near the Prudhoe Bay oil fields. It is one of the most remote stretches of paved and gravel road in the entire United States. There are no towns along most of it. There are no gas stations for hundreds of miles at a stretch. There is no cell coverage across enormous sections of the route. The road itself crosses the Arctic Circle at mile 115, then continues north through the Brooks Range. A wall of mountains so vast and so cold that even in summer, experienced travelers treat it with deep respect. In winter, it is a different world entirely. Roughly 3,700 large trucks travel the Dalton every single month, even in the depths of the Arctic winter. They carry fuel, drilling equipment, food, machinery, and supplies to the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay. Without those trucks, the oil fields stop. Without those trucks, the communities along the route lose their lifeline. And so the trucks keep moving, month after month, through conditions that most people in the lower 48 states have never experienced and probably never will. The drivers who run this route know something that takes years to fully understand. Surviving the Arctic is not about being tough. It is about being prepared, and nowhere is that preparation more invisible or more sophisticated than in the sleeper cab, where a driver has to create a livable environment inside a vehicle, while the outside world is trying to kill everything that holds heat. Most people, when they think about sleeping in a truck in extreme cold, imagine something like camping. They picture a person bundled under blankets, shivering slightly, listening to wind batter the windows, waiting for morning. That image is not wrong for some drivers in some situations, but for the experienced long-haul truckers who make the Arctic run regularly, that picture is completely outdated. The technology built into modern sleeper cabs, and the personal knowledge drivers build up over years on northern routes, create something closer to a sealed thermal environment than a camping situation. Here is where it starts to get interesting. The first challenge of sleeping in extreme cold is a problem that most people never think about until they are facing it. If you turn off a diesel truck's engine in -40-degree temperatures, you may not be able to start it again. The oil thickens. The coolant loses its ability to protect the engine. The fuel itself begins to behave in ways that most people who have only driven gasoline cars have never considered. Diesel fuel contains paraffin wax, a natural byproduct of crude oil refinement. In normal temperatures, this wax dissolves harmlessly in the fuel and causes no issues. But as the temperature drops below about 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the wax begins to crystallize. By the time you reach 10 to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, which is a typical night temperature on the Dalton in January, not an extreme. That wax can begin to gel, clogging fuel filters and starving the engine of fuel. In severe cold, an untreated tank can gel so completely that the truck becomes impossible to start. And in the Arctic, a truck that cannot start is not an inconvenience. It is an emergency. This is why drivers running northern routes treat their fuel before the cold hits, adding anti-gel additives to every tank. Some use a ratio of kerosene mixed into their diesel to lower the gelling point further. They also use block heaters, electrical heating elements that keep the engine block warm enough to start even after hours of sitting in extreme cold. On the Dalton, some drivers keep their engines running continuously during rest stops rather than risk a cold start, though this creates its own complications with idling regulations and fuel consumption. Others use coolant heaters and tank heaters plumbed directly into the truck's systems to maintain engine temperature without keeping the full engine running. The layering of these systems is not accidental. It is the product of decades of hard lessons learned by drivers who came before. But all of that is about keeping the truck alive. The driver still has to sleep. The solution to that problem is called a bunk heater, and it represents one of the most underappreciated pieces of engineering in long-haul trucking. A bunk heater, made by companies like Espar or Webasto, whose names are well known to any driver who has spent time in extreme cold, is a small, self-contained diesel-fired furnace mounted inside the sleeper cab. It burns diesel fuel directly from the truck's main tanks, but at a fraction of the rate the main engine would consume. While running the main engine overnight to stay warm burns roughly half a gallon of diesel per hour, adding up to about 4 gallons for an 8-hour sleep. A properly functioning bunk heater can maintain a comfortable sleeping temperature at a fraction of that fuel cost. The unit pulls air from outside, heats it internally, and circulates warm air through the sleeper berth continuously. The temperature can be set just like a thermostat. The driver goes to sleep. The heater runs. The sleeper cab stays warm. Outside, it is -40. Inside, it is 68 degrees. Most people never realize this exists. When they picture a truck driver sleeping in the Arctic, they imagine a person suffering. What they do not picture is a person who has essentially brought their bedroom with them. But the bunk heater is only part of what makes this work. The other part is the sleeper cab itself, and how drivers learn to use it over years of experience on difficult routes. Modern sleeper cabs, the large units mounted behind the cab on long-haul trucks, are insulated spaces. They are not as insulated as a well-built house, but significantly better than most people expect. The berths are sized to accommodate a mattress running roughly 75 to 80 inches long, with widths that vary from about 36 to 42 inches on different truck models. The Freightliner Cascadia, one of the most common trucks on long-haul routes, offers a sleeping area that can fit 3 different mattress sizes. Higher-end configurations include refrigerators, microwaves, and power inverters that allow drivers to run electronics without running the main engine. The sleeper is separated from the cab by a heavy curtain that, when closed, creates a sealed thermal pocket. When a bunk heater is running in that sealed space, the temperature differential between inside and outside can exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Experienced drivers learn quickly that the curtain is not optional. It is the single most important tool for managing temperature in extreme cold. The cab, the front driving area, has large windshields and comparatively poor insulation. It loses heat rapidly. The sleeper, separated by the curtain, retains heat far more efficiently. Drivers who understand this keep the curtain closed tight and sleep in the back even during their rest stops, treating the cab essentially as a separate zone that they enter only to drive. They also learn to manage what they wear. On a route like the Dalton, experienced drivers keep their cold weather gear, insulated boots, heavy pants, thermal base layers, gloves, hats, close to the bunk, not because they expect to need them during the night, if the heater is functioning properly, but because if the heater fails, they need to be able to get dressed and respond quickly. A heater failure at -40 is not a situation you dress slowly for. And heater failures do happen. This is something that experienced drivers speak about with a kind of practiced calm that younger drivers find impressive until they experience it themselves. Bunk heaters are reliable, but they are mechanical devices operating in extreme conditions. They can fail. The fuel line can develop a blockage. The igniter can malfunction. In those moments, the difference between a driver who has prepared properly and one who has not becomes immediately apparent. Experienced drivers on the Dalton carry emergency blankets, sleeping bags rated for extreme cold, and in some cases battery-powered backup heating options. They know the location of every possible shelter point on the route. They know that Coldfoot, the northernmost truck stop in the world, located at mile 175 on the Dalton, 60 miles north of the Arctic Circle, represents the midpoint and the only place with food, fuel, and basic services on a 470-mile stretch of road. If something goes wrong between Fairbanks and Deadhorse, the options for help are not numerous. Coldfoot itself is a remarkable place that most people have never heard of, and probably never will unless they end up on the Dalton. The truck stop was described by one of its own managers as having been built in the 80s by truck drivers, for truck drivers. It is modest in the way that everything in that part of Alaska is modest, functional, not decorative. It has a small cafe, fuel pumps, some accommodations, and a mechanic. Cell phone coverage arrived only relatively recently. The post office opens only a few days a week. But for a driver who has spent hours alone on the Frozen Hall Road, with nothing but the pipeline running alongside as a companion, Coldfoot is as close to civilization as the word gets in that part of the world. Drivers stop there to eat, refuel, check weather updates, and talk to other drivers coming from the opposite direction about what conditions look like ahead. That information exchange, driver to driver, face to face, at places like Coldfoot, is itself one of the survival mechanisms of the Dalton. There are 40 to 50 avalanche paths along Atigun Pass, the mountain crossing in the Brooks Range that every Dalton driver must navigate. The Department of Transportation uses 11-foot-long avalanche guns to clear potential slides and keep the pass open. But conditions can change quickly. A driver who has just come through the pass can tell a driver about to enter it things that no weather service would know yet. Where the black ice starts, where the wind shifts across the road, where the shoulder disappears under a drift. That knowledge, passed informally between professionals who share the same route, is part of what makes the Dalton survivable. It also speaks to something larger about trucking culture in extreme environments, which is that the drivers who do this work long-term are not cowboys. The popular image of the ice road trucker, fearless, reckless, running hot and fast through dangerous conditions for the thrill of it, is largely a television invention. The drivers who actually survive these routes for years are the ones who build systems, who know their equipment deeply, who manage fatigue with the same seriousness they manage their schedule, who sleep when they need to sleep, eat when they need to eat, and make conservative decisions when the road ahead looks uncertain. This connects to something that most people never consider when they think about truck drivers sleeping in their cabs rather than hotels. For many of these drivers, the sleeper cab is not a sacrifice. It is a preference. Running a diesel engine overnight for heat and air conditioning burns roughly half a gallon of fuel per hour, about $25 for an 8-hour rest, compared to a hotel room at $100 or more per night. The math already favors the cab. But on routes like the Dalton, the math is not even the main factor. Many truck stops along extreme routes do not have adjacent hotels. The closest accommodation in many cases is miles away from where a driver legally must stop for their mandatory 10-hour rest period under federal hours of service regulations. And even where hotels exist, drivers who have been on the road for years often report something that surprises people who have never tried it. They actually sleep better in their trucks. This is not romantic. It is practical. The sleeper cab is the same space every night, the same mattress, which experienced drivers often upgrade from the standard factory mattress to higher quality foam. The same curtains, the same sounds of the APU, or bunk heater running. The same temperature they have dialed in exactly to their preference. Hotel rooms are different every night. Strange smells, strange noise levels, strange beds. The body does not adapt quickly to new sleep environments. For a driver who has been sleeping in the same truck for 2 years, the cab has become calibrated to their sleep in a way that no hotel room ever will be. Some drivers describe a paradox that took them time to understand. The smaller the space, the faster it warms, and the more completely it insulates against the outside world. A hotel room at -40 degrees is fighting a losing battle against thin windows and exterior walls designed for a climate that rarely sees such temperatures. A sleeper cab is a sealed curtained space that a bunk heater can warm to sleeping temperature in minutes. The cold outside becomes almost irrelevant once the system is running properly. There is still something else, something underneath all the practical explanations that experienced drivers on extreme routes talk about when they describe sleeping in their trucks through Arctic winters. It is harder to put into numbers than fuel cost or temperature differentials, but it is real nonetheless. When a driver parks on the shoulder of the Dalton Highway in January, shuts the front curtains, turns on the bunk heater, climbs into a sleeping bag on a mattress they chose themselves, and hears the wind outside failing to reach them, there is a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from being completely self-sufficient in a hostile environment. The truck is their shelter. They built their shelter. They know it works. Outside, one of the harshest landscapes on the North American continent is doing its worst. Inside, the temperature holds. That is not suffering. That is competence. And for the drivers who have made this their life's work, competence feels better than comfort. The next time you look out the window during a winter storm and feel grateful for walls and central heating, remember that somewhere to the north, there are drivers parked along roads you have likely never driven, in weather you have likely never experienced, sleeping inside vehicles that most people think of only as cargo movers. They have managed their fuel, their temperatures, their equipment, and their rest with the same methodical care that a surgeon brings to a procedure. They will wake in a few hours, check their systems, let the engine warm, and continue north toward Prudhoe Bay, carrying the supplies that keep the oil fields running, the equipment that keeps remote communities alive, the cargo that the infrastructure of that part of the world depends on. The world in extreme environments does not stop moving because the conditions become impossible. It keeps moving because certain people make it their business to ensure that it does. If sleeping in -40 degrees in the Arctic seems like the outer edge of what truck drivers manage, wait until you understand what happens when those same drivers have to move through wildfire corridors in the western United States, where the problem is not preserving heat, but surviving a wall of fire moving faster than many people can drive. Because the cold is only one edge of the world these drivers navigate,